All right, welcome to Chapter 2. We're going to be talking about the causes of crime. Um, an alternative name for this chapter would be Criminology. And again, like most of the chapters that we're going to be going over in this course, Chapter 2, Criminology, is also a separate course that's taught at Wake Tech and at many universities. In fact, criminology itself is a science. You can get a PhD in criminology, so it is a huge field. So it's a lot like if I said, well, we're going to have a chapter on what medicine is, and I'm having to cover, diseases and anatomy and bones. So just be aware that this chapter is a good introduction to some of the ideas of criminology, particularly a little bit of the history of criminology. But again, we're just going to be able to skim the surface here. If you're interested, we have several good professors, sometimes myself. I won't include myself as a good professor just yet. It's up to you to make that decision. We have several good professors who teach criminology, so consider taking that class at some point if you'd like. Okay, like most of these, the first thing that usually I talk about is some basic questions. So I guess there's one I kind of left off the slide, and I frequently get it from students, is why are we studying a bunch of theories? I think that's part of the problem that many people in America have with science. We don't appreciate and understand the impact of science or how it is developed as much. We tend to use words very casually that in scientific vocabularies have much more precise meaning. So I'm going to talk about some of those issues, but if I had to give you one quick reason why we want to look for a theory of crime, why we want to try to understand crime as a theoretical concept is, if you could understand why crime occurs, then I would say you're pretty much halfway to getting to this is how we stop it. So, what are the basic reasons to develop a theory of crime? I guess we can have scientific curiosity. We can have things like it'll help us understand why crime occurs. It'll help us prevent it. I think it's also fair to say, and this is another problem, a general problem with learning, a general problem with knowledge, is it is possible that there is no single explanation or general theory of crime. And I certainly think, depending upon the type of crimes you're talking about, if you talked about, say, murder, there are different types of murder, so it's entirely possible there are different theories as to why people would commit murder. There are different types of rape. There are different types of larceny. The motivations of someone who's starving and steals a loaf of bread are vastly different than someone who is pathological and is embezzling or stealing even though he's a millionaire. We have to try to find, whenever we do any sort of exploration here, what assumptions that we go in or blind spots we might have that could lead us into error here. And I think in particular for students in the 21st century, we need to be very careful that even though we're using words in our everyday vocabulary like theory and hypothesis, they have a little bit different meaning when they are applied in a pure scientific sense. But we'll hit some of that in a bit. And of course, we can fairly ask, do we want empirical, which is data that we can gather up and hopefully objectively look at? Is it better than subjective data? Because I think this is an interesting question. There's so much of the criminal justice system that is really based upon very subjective ideas, like what is the motive of an individual? Is an action good or bad? So it's a complex topic, and I think it's also fair to say that maybe in some cases subjective data has greater weight or greater value than in other cases. And certainly I think objective data, because I am at my heart a rationalist, would like to believe that objective data is what we should always seek, at least in part. Okay, so we've got those learning objectives again. We usually will see those at the beginning of each chapter. It's really just a broad, quick snapshot of the different 9 or 10 different major things we're trying to get to. Not something that you need to study as a slide or write down in your notes. Okay, so let's start. Criminology. Now, criminology is the scientific study of crime and the causes of criminal behavior. When people first started trying to form science, whether we're talking about the subset of science of, say, chemistry or criminology, you have to understand that very often people were starting from places of profound ignorance and confusion. Now, I'm not saying they were stupid. I'm using the term ignorant as in they are unaware. I am ignorant of what is going on. And we also have to remember that many of the people that started the study of criminology started with biases and prejudices that we would recognize today as things that would really be very difficult to hold those opinions and to also really conduct an accurate, objective approach to crime. Okay, so criminologists are people who study crime. And it has emerged, certainly in the last 50 years or so, as an important part of science. Now, we do have a problem because obviously we're focusing on human behavior. If we are trying to determine why a rat or an amoeba does something, you can do all sorts of things to lower animals, to plants, to single cell animals, that you can't do on human beings. It is unethical to conduct experiments on human beings, particularly without letting them know, within mild parameters. So it's difficult to use, I guess you could say, the pure scientific method here, and I think that's in part where things like subjectivity creep in. Also, and I think this is an important point to remember going forward, we're going to talk about a lot of these theories. It's going to be common in the human experience, whether we're talking about crime or love or hate or envy or greed, I'm just talking about emotions there, that there's more than a single explanation for it. If you love someone, I can't say, well, it's a biological process and that's all there is to it. Yeah, there's a component of biology in love, but there's all these other factors that go into it, familiarity, compatibility. So do try, as we're looking at some of these theories coming up, to say, well, maybe that part of it is useful, or maybe that part is, to use a crude analogy, is 60 or 70% of the explanation. And this is true, but it's probably a really small part of the explanation, maybe 5 or 10%. I'm just throwing out numbers to give you an appreciation of what I'm talking about there. Okay, so one of the things I've been hemming and hawing around about is the vocabulary. If you watch a TV program or if you're engaging in a conversation with someone, people will often say, hey, I have a theory. That's fine. Theory in the common vernacular, the common speech, really means that you have a guess. Maybe an informed guess, but really a guess. In the modern scientific theory, we're talking about something different. So the National Academy of Sciences gives us a good definition here to run with. It says a scientific theory is some scientific explanation so well established that no new evidence is likely to alter them, theory is, a comprehensive explanation of important feature of nature supported by facts and gathered over time. Theories, in particular, are very useful in the scientific sense because they allow us to make predictions about future events or results, and, as corollary of this, they allow us to look into the past. So, let's take a common modern scientific theory, in quotes, the theory of gravity. Now, gravity, I suppose, if we're in a kind of a stricter scientific sense, we could go back to Newtonian physics. So the kind of initial scientific explanation of gravity would start in the 1600s, we'll say, although clearly people appreciated some of the aspects of physics and gravity before that. What has happened over the last 2 or 3 centuries in our exploration of science is we've taken some very crude ideas about gravity, and we have refined them, and we have studied them, and we have measured gravity, and we have determined, in part at least, how it affects objects. Now, we haven't come to a complete explanation of gravity. That's something that we're really searching for, exactly how it's generated. I mean, we know what it's associated with, mass, but we don't quite know how it's generated. But you notice that even though that we don't know everything about gravity, we can make predictions as to future results. If I throw this ball at you, if I don't throw it hard enough, gravity will compel it to fall to the ground. Okay, what does this all have to do with criminology? Well, let's take a theory that went through the sort of same evolution in criminology, the theory of fingerprints. When this is first advanced, and there is some evidence of it, clearly there was some appreciation of this early, but when it starts to get advanced kind of as a proper theory, it's really in the 1800s, late 1800s, where people begin to say, everybody seems to have these little ridges on their fingers. They form a pattern, and then someone said, okay, well, I've looked at 100 or 1,000 of these, and this pattern seems to be unique to all individuals. So a theory of fingerprints arose. Now, this is a very narrow theory. It's a biological theory, but it has an impact on criminal justice, obviously. We theorize today that every individual has a unique set of fingerprints. Now, think of how useful that is. When it's first suggested, we're not sure it's true. So if you were going to admit evidence into a court, it could be challenged because you could say, well, you haven't proved that these fingerprints are unique yet. You haven't really moved it from a kind of a guess into a true theory. But over time, we were able to do that. Over time, we're able to demonstrate that it is, in fact, true that people have unique fingerprints. Now, could you change it into a fact? Could you just say, well, it's a fact, as opposed to a scientific theory, that people's fingerprints are unique? Well, I guess theoretically what you would have to do would, you would have to get everybody's fingerprints who's alive today and compare them. And then, arguably, everybody that's ever been born and everybody that's born in the future, and make sure they don't match. So that would be impossible in a practical sense. But we can be scientifically certain to a high degree that people's individual fingerprints are unique. And that allows us to make predictions like, yes, or describe past events like, yes, the fingerprints found on the gun belong to John. We have gathered John's fingerprints, we have compared them, they match. So a modern scientific theory is different than I have a guess. It's got a lot of factual support and often has a pedigree or a time period behind it that really helps support it. Okay, a couple things to remember when we start talking in theory: correlation and causation. Correlation is a relationship, okay, between two measured behaviors that tend to move in the same direction. So it is often easy to see that these two things happen together. But simply because two things happen together doesn't mean they are caused one by the other. So we famously say correlation is not causation. Now, can there be an underlying relationship between the two that means this is why they're going together? Sure. If I looked at number of airplanes taking off from RDU Airport, and then I looked at number of homicides in Raleigh in raw numbers, you know what you would see? In the 20th century, if we started that graph from 1900 to 2000, you would see that number of aircrafts taking off from Raleigh-Durham Airport has gone up. You would also see that the number of murders that occurred in Raleigh between 1900 and 2000 have gone up. There's a correlation between those two events, okay? The first correlation is the population of Raleigh was increasing, okay? The number of murders is increasing, hens, but that doesn't have anything to do with the airplane taking off. Yeah, there's a correlation, but the true correlation is population increase, advancing of aerospace science. Causation means one thing tends to cause the other. Okay? Um, it can be very difficult when we're talking about human behavior to prove causation because human beings are very complex to study. And often what we can say is, well, this is in part the reason. It's now, it's not always. Sometimes we can come up with pretty good explanations. Think of this in a medical sense. Maybe that'll help you. Some diseases, we can look and we can say, that's what caused it. So if you get jaundice, if you get blood poisoning, okay, if you if you get food poisoning, we can point very often to the individual germ or virus that caused the illness. But some illnesses, you notice, are a little bit more complex, like cancer. We could say, well, some individuals have a predisposition to this type of cancer. That's a possible causation. You smoked. That's a possible causation. You had this episode of lung disease. That's a possible causation. Okay, so correlation, causation, not the same thing, but useful terms to remember as we look to theory. All right, theories are more robust. They have very strong evidence. Hypothesis is really more like a guess. These are possible explanations. And to really be a true hypothesis as opposed to just a guess, a wild guess, we have to be able to test it. And then hopefully, as the hypothesis is tested, we develop a body of proof or evidence that shows, okay, this is true, or no, this is false. We need to discard this. Oops, sorry. Old and new theory. Now I include this because, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, a lot of older theories were less developed. They came from a position of ignorance. And over time, the beginning of this theory sometimes can change into something that's radically different or is much more complex than our initial theory. So, Newton famously might have been responsible when, somewhat apocryphal, but when the apple fell on his head and he said, oh, gravity, eureka. But Newtonian physics, and he developed all sorts of things, like he invented calculus, not really the calculus we use directly, but he invented calculus. Those fields have really, really undergone massive development. So Newtonian physics and gravity have all become much more complex because often these older theories were incomplete. They didn't have a lot of data, or sometimes, sadly, they were based on false assumptions. So remember, old theories can be rejected, modified, or confirmed. So, as an example, early theories of gravity, while true, have been modified. Okay, so let's jump into some theories because we've laid a lot of groundwork here in the first 20 minutes or so. The classical theory of criminology is something that I would say is really almost an underlying assumption of Western thought, and that's free will. Now, that's not to say it's not been rejected in Western thought. I'm going to say that it's really important in Western thought. So, why did John kill Mary? And the answer to that is John chose to kill Mary. So the theory is people have free will, they exercise that free will, and in the exercise of that free will, they kill or rob or rape, if we're talking of crime. Now, in this sense, in the criminology sense, this theory was largely developed by a man named Cesare Beccaria, who really posited that all decisions are the result of rational choice. People sit down and think. That because people fear punishment, that's rational, nobody, few exceptions we won't go into, nobody wants to be harmed, okay? So the fear of punishment or harm deters people when they rationally think about something from committing a crime. Therefore, this is kind of the conclusion, the more certain and swift and harsh the punishment, the less likely people are to commit crime. And people still today think this way. And I'm not saying that this is wrong. I'm not saying that free will or rational choice theory is wrong. I'm saying that obviously there's a few things that make it more complex. Okay, that's a picture of Cesare Beccaria, and that's his book, Essays on Crime and Punishment. Now, Cesare Beccaria was an Italian. That's an Italian translation, or a translation from Italian. Okay, now, unfortunately, another guy named Cesare, but this is Cesare Lombroso, who's a little bit different, really took some of this rational choice and applied it more to criminology. And he thought, it's much more complex biological, psychological, social decision. And free will is not as important, maybe not even, if you look at Lombroso, very important. Decisions to commit crimes are made within the context of the time, the place, the individual, the biology. Now, this has not gone unchallenged. Even in the 20th century, James Q. Wilson, a very famous scientist, argued that people do indeed weigh choices. And what will happen is, again, you can see how this refers back to Beccaria, if the benefits of crime outweigh the penalties of crime, then people will commit crime. So we can see this in our own lives when we drive cars. If I want to get someplace faster, and I know I can speed 5 miles over the limit and not get caught, I will commit the crime of 5 miles over. Now, if I thought if I got caught, they're going to take me out of the car and kill me, I might weigh my choices and say, no, I won't do it. Now, Jack Katz, another scientist, argues that people will also commit crime because they choose, because they want, they seek thrill. Modern rational choice theory is the dominant theory of the American system and public. However, I would say that most criminologists, while acknowledging the importance of this theory, don't place it as the dominant explanation, certainly not as the single or singular definition. So what are some of the ones that kind of challenge Beccaria and Wilson's rational choice? Well, remember, there was this introduction by Lombroso, but people took that and ran with it. Biological theories have been developed that focus on things like genetics and hormone and brain chemistry. And one of the ways this has been studied is, and this is fascinating, there's a series of what are called the Danish twin studies, where they took identical twins who were separated at birth and they placed them in different households. And then they looked at did they or didn't they commit crimes. They did other things, but that's one of the things they did. Very crudely, we found that there is a high degree of similarity between the crime rates of biologically separated identical twins. That would tend to tell you that there's some sort of genetic component to at least certain types of crime. Now, psychological looks at a mental process and behavior. And now this can be shaped by biology. Sometimes this is called neurocriminology. And this can be the idea that you have criminal traits or tendencies that can be triggered internally or by external factors. Again, there's some good evidence to support this, somewhat referring back to genetics. One of the examples I use is if you went to Central Prison with me and we were on a tour and you looked at all the murderers in Central Prison, one of the things that would strike you is that they are, well, Central Prison, but if we looked at all murders, they're young males. So it seems, and the numbers are a little difficult to tease out, there's been a few, but it seems that male murderers outnumber female murderers by something like 8 to 1. Okay, well, that means, since maleness in this sense is being determined by genetics, by biology, that there is some underlying link, maybe not causation, maybe it's a correlation and there's something deeper, maybe it's a hormone, okay, that seems to be triggering this aggressive, fatal behavior. Okay, mental illness. Now, a link has been established between some crimes, and I hesitate to say this, and schizophrenia. But I want to emphasize something because schizophrenia is one of those things that has entered the popular media and has become kind of a trope, something that we just show over and over again. You know, the crazy guy who kills other people. You have to remember that most schizophrenics are not dangerous. Most schizophrenics, these are people that suffer a break with reality to some extent, to simplify it. They are not dangerous. Many people, though, who commit mass crime seem to have some level of schizophrenia. So, if we were to simplify this, most schizophrenics are not dangerous. A small subset of schizophrenics seem to be dangerous. It's difficult to look at the role of mental illness in crime because it's hard, really, when you start to study it, to decide what's normal and what's healthy. A lot of the early ideas of mental health focused on very dubious ideas with not a lot of scientific support. Sigmund Freud is kind of famous here. We know some of how the mind works mechanically, but we're a lot less sure about ideas like personality and tendency and emotion than we assumed back in Freud's day, back in the early part of the 20th century. Okay, psychological and trait theory. So social psychologically focuses on how we act in groups, and there's some fascinating information here. So famously, and you can often see these experiments online, Philip Zimbardo put a bunch of volunteers in a room and had a guy in a white lab coat stand behind them and made them believe that they were administering shocks to other people. Now they weren't, but they made them believe it, and he made them essentially believe that they were harming other individuals. And the reason they did it was they were just being told by this guy in a white lab coat to do it. And the scary thing is how many people went to the point, arguably, of, in quotes here, killing the other person just because they were told to do it. Now, think about how this could play out in how people kill if they're a member of a gang or a group. If you're in a gang and the gang tells you to kill, how many people, or steal, how many people can resist that? Trait theory looks for traits or tendencies to commit crimes and seeks to eliminate them from the individual as sort of application. Now, it's a little bit unpopular until recently, the trait theory, but there's been a subset of psychological treatment called cognitive behavioral therapy, and that seems to be turning that around a little bit. We tend to be looking now for how we reshape or change these tendencies. All right, some other theories, and there's a whole bunch here. And again, there are books written on each one of these theories. The sociological theories of crime. This focus not on the individual, but on the system you live in. Social disorganization, sometimes called the Chicago School. This argues that crime comes from bad neighborhoods, which breed crime and criminal behavior as what is normal. And, that's, again, let's take a quick look at that one. That seems reasonable, right? If you look at the number of muggings that occur in a neighborhood, very often that is a economically disadvantaged neighborhood. So that would seem to breed criminal behavior. But if I look at the number of people who commit bank fraud, well, you're going to find out that most of them live in very good neighborhoods because they're rich bankers. So I think a lot of this has to do with what crime are you talking about here and what's normal. Doesn't mean to discount it, but again, something to throw in the mix. The strain theory, which is a fairly early one, it was proposed by a man named Durkheim. He argued that when the individual can't achieve, he tends to, or the anome, the individual can be isolated from society and break down what is normal. That's a gross simplification of Durkheim's theory. Cultural deviance, subject to reject what is normal and embrace criminal behavior. Social structure theory, preventing crime would be centered around improving, and this goes back to social disorganization, social and economic living conditions. If you don't want people to steal bread, give people bread. If you don't want people to beat other people up, find a way that they can express themselves. You could make an argument, I'm not saying it's true, but think about this. We've seen a decrease in crime in the last 25 years. Well, maybe people in the past who wanted to enjoy violence vicariously, like by beating other people up or seeing other people beat up, were able to express that and satisfy that desire by playing video games. So I'm not saying this is true. I'm just advancing this as a wild theory, not even a theory. It's a hypothesis. Let's use our language right. And saying, maybe you prevent crime by providing alternatives. All right, social conflict theories. A little bit more about this, the anemone. Now, one of the things social conflict theory, which kind of arose out of the anomie and the strain theory, and really kind of embraced, I'm using kind of too much, and really embraced much of Marxism, economic Marxism. Social conflict saw crime as a conflict between economic classes. And the emphasis was that the criminal law was simply a tool of those in power, the haves, to keep the have-nots from getting anything. And you can see this in racial threat theory, which says that the criminal law is essentially a tool to maintain white dominance, in America at least. And again, that's a gross simplification, but I'm reminded in the 1930s when I think it was Dillinger or one of the bank robbers was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" And his answer was, "Because that's where the money is." Why do people steal? Because they want what they don't have. Again, not a single explanation. Social conflict in public policy. This has largely been rejected by the power structure, except sometimes when people talk about including more minorities and women in the criminal justice system and running it. Life lesson in criminal behavior. These are some more theories. Social process says crime is a result of persons' interactions with the environment via the tools it socializes. So how you, and to look at a subset of this, let's look at the learning theory by Edward Sutherland. How do people learn to drive drunk? Right? Nobody is born driving drunk. You've got to go through a process where first you learn to drive a car. If you had a propensity to drive drunk, but you grew up in pre-industrial America, you're not going to drive drunk. Even when you learn to drink, if you think about this, there is a process whereby if you take your first bit of alcohol, it doesn't taste good, and yet you learn to appreciate, to like, in the terms of an alcoholic who might be our theoretical drunk driver, to obsessively like this. Control theory says, and this is Hershey and Wilson, not the same James Q. Wilson we talked about before, said that crimes occur when the restraints or the controls in society break down. Labeling theory says, well, one of the things that happens is when you call someone something, they begin to live that role as you define it. And you've heard it said, if you call a kid a loser enough, he'll act like one. Well, this is that in a broader sense. If you say, oh, well, all fill in the blank, pick an imaginary group, all Martians are thieves. And if you treat every Martian you see as a thief and you watch him and restrict his activities and conduct more random searches of these Martians, then you actually foster a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, social process theories and public policy, if we're going to apply some of these, we would, in a lot of this stuff, be looking to intervene very early. We want to get to people before they are fully formed as criminals, before the labels have been applied, before the controls have broken down, before they've learned to commit crime. Life course theories, and there's a bunch here, These are behavior patterns formed in childhood that lead to delinquency. Now, one, and this can actually, this is Gottfredson, this could have a genetic component because a lot of these theories don't stand by themselves. You could say, well, some of this borrows from strain, some of this borrows from genetics, some of this borrows from Wilson's work. But the self-control theory says, okay, people that have low self-control, particularly people that are impulsive, thrill seekers, innately violent, and then are poorly socialized to control those traits, will turn to crime. People like Moffat, Sampson, Lobb would talk about the intervention or stability that allows people to be rehabilitated. So you take these individuals that have propensities towards these things, and again, this goes back to some of those control theories. You marry them, or you give them a job, or you put them in a structure, and this could rehabilitate them. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about drugs. So the use of drugs has been shown to make the people using it both likely an offender as opposed to the general population and as a victim. But I think we have to understand that there's lots of things you can label a drug. An aspirin is a drug. You wouldn't say that, well, an aspirin, anybody takes an aspirin, they're a druggie. If we're looking at drugs, probably the one drug that's the most abused in America today is alcohol. About 138 million, or half the adult population or so. Again, quick number. About half the adult population drinks. 64 million people use tobacco, and there's lots of drugs in tobacco. The primary ones that we would be concerned with would be things like nicotine. And then you've got all the illegal drugs that are out there. You've got the marijuana, you've got the psychotherapeutics, you've got things like cocaine, hallucinogens, heroin, which is spelled wrong in this slide. What's the impact? Well, let's look at one of the most severe. We talk about how dangerous drugs are, so what's the most dangerous drugs? Well, there it is, drunk drivers. Drunk drivers kill perhaps as many as 10,000 people a year. And almost 90,000 people die every year because of alcohol. Not necessarily drunk driving. It could be things like cirrhosis of the liver. It could be, pick your disease that it derives from. Tobacco, our friend nicotine, kills about 500,000 Americans every year. 40,000 from secondhand smoke. If we look at drug overdoses, these are going to be things like fentanyl, the opiates, heroins, still exceedingly dangerous, 60,000. Approximately 1 in 4 violent crimes have a link to alcohol use. Again, the person might be the person was drinking that committed the crime, or the victim might have been drunk, and we show that link, because that would obviously make you more vulnerable. But even homicides, even the worst crimes, so let's look at these numbers. You can see how it runs from April of 2009 to March of 2019. So we're looking at a 10-year graph here. So if we look at that, here are your homicides. They go down, 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 up, 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 down, 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 down. Okay? But these are the ones that are drug related. And you can see that most homicides, maybe a quarter of them have some relationship to drugs in some way, shape, or form, but the vast bulk don't. The why of drug use. There's lots of theories as to why people use drugs and abuse them. So let's take alcohol as a quick example. Of everybody that uses alcohol, only somewhere between 12 and 13% of alcohol users could be classified as alcoholics. Now, I've heard a couple different numbers, so let's be generous to that. The statistic I heard is that 80% of the alcohol consumed in the United States is consumed by just 20% of the people that drink. And the other 80% of the people that drink only drink about 20% of the alcohol. So, you've got a real subgroup of alcoholics that are drinking a lot of alcohol. If we look at marijuana users, now, again, addiction here is a kind of a loaded term. I guess a fairer term would be habitual for marijuana users because it's difficult to establish a physiological craving for marijuana. About 9% seem to be very heavy users. Not all drugs are in the same pattern of addiction, of use, of damage. Now, one theory would say that it's the learning process. Others would say you learn the pleasure of use and learn the social experience of use. Still others would say, well, there is a genetic, a chemical tendency, or a psychological tendency. A quick example here. One of the things we found is that human beings don't all process alcohol through their bodies in the same way. Some individuals have different chemical pathways because of their genetics in how they process alcohol. Famously, American Indians, Marids, Native Americans, seem to be genetically predisposed, because of their genetic history, to process alcohol differently, which may explain high rates of alcohol abuse inside the Native American community. Drug addiction and dependency. Drug abuse is the use of a drug that causes harm to the abuser or third party. It's perfectly okay to have to use a drug if it's not harming you. So, to give a personal example, I am on a blood thinner to prevent clots, and I've been taking it for 4 or 5 years now. I am dependent upon this drug. I am a user. Now, I'm not addicted to it because it doesn't create a physiological craving to thin out my blood, but I need it, and it helps me. About 90% of first-time users do not evolve into abusers. Addiction itself can be either psychological, your mind craves it, or there can be a physical process. Now, the physical process exists in different pathways, as we said, but the one that we tend to best understand is that there is a neurotransmitter, something that is related to the neurons or the nerve cells in your brain. And there's a chemical called dopamine that the neurotransmitter in the brain is triggered by these drugs. And this dopamine is released, or there's a substitute for it, and it sends a sensation of pleasure. And the receptors to dopamine can become less able to experience pleasure at the same level of drugs. So what happens is, the physical process is, this doesn't get you high anymore, so you need more drugs and more drugs. And then, of course, they're just not having effect on neurotransmitters. Drugs can have effects on other parts of your body. If you need more and more alcohol to get drunk, that means you're likely to be suffering more and more damage through mechanisms like cirrhosis of the liver. We also think that some addicts seem to be predisposed genetically to addiction. Some of the groundbreaking evidence tends to show that they have higher levels of certain enzymes in their bodies. Okay, so let's turn this back towards crime and criminology. So, 3 general relationships can exist between crimes and drugs. There are drug-defined crimes. Here we make something a crime because it relates to the drug. Making a drug, using the drug, producing the drug, making use of the drug, producing the drug, transporting the drug, selling the drug, or buying the drug. Okay, so that's one way in which you have crime. The second way is crimes committed to support the drug trade. So I shoot someone in order that I can control the drug trade. And the third, drug-using lifestyle crimes, are crimes committed in support of using drugs or committed while on these drugs. Now, some of the interesting statistics is that 2/3 of those arrested in the United States will have drugs in their system, and that's going to include alcohol. A scientist named Freeman estimated that drugs increase the likelihood of violence by a factor of 7. I'm not sure that his data is great, but I think that it's certainly true that you will hear people say, man, I was so wasted, that's why I did this. Or I never would have done that while I was sober. or I only got mad because I was drunk. Drugs and national health. There has been, of course, and we are continuing to experience an opioid epidemic. The deaths related to opiates have increased about 500% since 1999. A lot of this, sadly, came out of the legitimate so-called pharmaceutical industry. A drug company created basically an opioid, and then claimed, with very scant scientific evidence, that it wasn't addictive, and then rigorously sold it, and we had an explosion in drug use. When these addicts for these opioids that were being given legitimately by doctors for things like pain and injury couldn't get it anymore, they often turned towards, because sometimes it was cheaper than the opioids that you would get, they turned to illegal drugs like heroin. The total direct and indirect cost for drug use in the United States may be as high as $1.45 trillion, including 500, almost 600 billion in economic loss and 800 billion in societal harm. And that could be things like guy got drunk, went home, beat up his wife. Okay, so there's direct loss. She might have a job. Now she's not earning that money. That impacts the economy. But there's social harm there. Okay, her kids, if she has kids, now maybe are in foster care, or her kids have been denied a mother. Okay, these are national drug-involved overdose deaths. You can see that these synthetic opioids, pretty bad here. Then you've got these abuse potentials, primarily the methamphetamines, your cocaines, your opioids, your methadone, your heroines, antidepressants. You can see that there's been a real spike. There's the medical model of addiction, which essentially, and you can see how this relates to a lot of the theories we're talking about before, right? This is why we're looking at this. You can take some of these theories and say, okay, why do people become an addict? Is it their free choice to become an addict? Is it because their body has addicted them? So the medical model says if you're an addict, you are essentially physically driven to use the drug. And the emphasis for the medical model of addiction, if you've got an addict, is to treat them. The criminal model of addiction goes back to our early rational choice. And it says people choose to use these drugs. And the way you stop them from using it is you punish them for using it. Well, we're seeing this played out, of course, in marijuana laws. There is today going on a marijuana debate about legalization and decriminalization. The argument is that legalization would, at least in part, here's one positive, end about a $40 billion black market for marijuana. It would remove the stigma from conviction. It would transfer the cost of enforcement to it, okay, from, it costs us to, oh my gosh, now we're making money off of it. And one of the things we've been seeing is steadily increasing numbers of states and cities and counties decriminalizing marijuana. Now, Portugal has an interesting experiment, and this is out of the Lancet, which is arguably among the top 1 or 2, 3 or 4 maybe, medical journals in the world. The Lancet is that graph there, and it's essentially what happens is Portugal, the country of Portugal, around about the turn of the 20th to the 21st century, said, we've got these terrible problems. We've got a lot of overdose deaths. We have got people sharing needles and catching HIV. We've got a lot of people in our prisons. So you know what we need to do? We need to drop this as a criminal justice issue and approach it as a medical issue. And they simply legalized the possession of almost all drugs. Now, it's still illegal to sell to certain things, but basically the overall result of this was, looking at the practicality, Portugal goes from about 400 deaths to about 30. So it's about a 90% drop. It goes from 900 HIV being diagnosed to only 18. Now you got to remember that there's a huge social cost for those two things, right? And then, of course, the number of people that are actually in prison fell by almost from 4,000 to 1,000. So Portugal took a really radical approach in many ways, which seems to have worked out, although I do think that you should, for your own edification, explore this a little bit more. All right, which obviously brings up this slide, criminology from theory to practice. One of the things that we have argued as criminologists, and I'm going to include myself in that for a moment, is that there is a core group of chronic offenders. There's this small number of people that commit crimes out of proportion. Now, this should ring a bell to you. This should sound like that. The alcoholics, remember, 20% of alcoholics drink 80% of the alcohol. Well, 6 or 10% of chronic offenders commit 70% of the murders, 80% of the robberies, 70% of the assaults, 70% of the rapes. And this chronic 6%, 6 to 10%, is a pretty well established theory. Now, this begins to push us forward, because remember what theory tells us to do. Theory tells us to take this data and make future predictions. Well, in particular, we've been looking at things like domestic violence. If you've got someone that beat his wife once or twice, and he hasn't aged out, okay, then the odds of him doing in the future becomes much stronger. We begin to try to create from this theory accurate ways to predict future harm and to include these in sentencing. All right. Well, a little bit longer. I like to keep these at 45 minutes. I know we're right at 50. I will be posting some micro lectures coming up. They won't get up immediately, but if you're listening to this 6 months from now, they'll be up. If you're listening to it, in August, I may not have gotten them up. But I will be putting some micro lectures on theories and major criminological theories. I think that you could look at a little more, and the Portuguese experiment, because that's a very popular one. Other than that, we'll be moving on to Chapter 3 whenever you're ready and whenever I post it.